Hey, what's up, guys? Hello, Football Talk here. What a unique and interesting draft this really was. It didn't feel quite the same as usual, being right in the middle of the action with all the fans being there around the stage. But it was almost more of an intimate experience because you were in the living rooms of these NFL coaches and general managers and see how they operate a little bit. As I do every year, I wanted to give you an extensive recap of what happened over these 3 days. I don't really like handing out grades like most other people do, because to me that just don't really encapsulate the real value of a pick, in my opinion. You have to consider the fit for a team, what that team actually needed, but at the same time, we don't really fully understand yet what role that player will have for his future team. So we can't quite judge that at this point. It's just too much of a complex process for me to just give it a one-letter grade. Instead, I wanted to identify the biggest winners and losers, steals and reaches of the draft coming out the weekend. That means looking at the prospects, where they were selected compared to where I have them on my big board, and analyzing how teams operated the board, how they traded up and down to get the players they like, while still gaining value, acquiring picks. But I don't want to talk about the different clubs simply. I also included some of the players, some of the prospects who were drafted, and some of the veterans in the league who it might affect at this point. Just as a little side note here, I didn't really want to include players that slipped through the draft solely based on injuries in my steals. That would have just made things a little too easy. If you're interested, you can also check out my positional draft rankings and my big board to read up more in depth about what I think about these prospects and how I see them stacking up. But let's get into this video. I'm going to go back and forth between winner and loser until I get to the steals and reaches, so hang in there with me. One of my biggest winners absolutely is Drew Lock of the Denver Broncos. I don't think anybody received more help around him than the second-year quarterback did through the draft. It started in the first round when the Broncos actually could sit tight at number 15 overall and still select the guy they've been targeting all along, according to several reports, in Alabama's Jerry Jeudy. I think he's a perfect complement to Courtland Sutton as a savvy route runner who can line up in multiple spots along the formation. Then in the second, they came back and selected Penn State's KJ Hamler, who offers the ability to threaten the defense with his speed, can really eat up cushions, pretty much unlike anybody in this draft class. And it's just tough to put a hand on him when he has the ball, kind of like the buck, making people miss in space. Later on in day 2, they landed an absolute steal to me in LSU center Lloyd Cushenberry, who was my 35th overall prospect in this draft, and I think should immediately compete for the starting right guard spot. They already brought in Connor McGovern to play center for them, most likely. And they drafted Dalton Reisner in the second round out of Kansas State last year already at left guard. So they all of a sudden they have built a really strong interior three. On day 3, early on they selected Missouri tight end Albert Okwuegbunam, who can be used in a similar fashion to what they already had in Noah Fant, their first round pick last year, as kind of that seam stretching tight end who has the ability to be flexed out wide and be used in that capacity as well. When you think of ace sets with each of those tight ends on either side of the line streaking down the field, and then you have a big body target like Courtland Sutton going on an in-breaking route underneath that's a scary sight. And I also think when you look at their red zone offense now, it could be special because of all those big bodies they have there. Combine that with an excellent duo of running backs now with Phillip Lindsay and Melvin Gordon, and they are moving kind of in that range with Kansas City in terms of offensive firepower. I thought the Broncos also nailed their other picks with a physical Iowa corner, Michael Ojemudia, and an explosive penetrator on the interior D-line in Arkansas's McTalvin Ajim. They also brought in a mobile linebacker who's kind of slippery working around blocks and has some thump when he gets into collisions in Wake Forest's Justin Sternett, and a technically sound edge rusher in Tarek Tuska, who was kind of a sleeper for me as well out of North Dakota State. Another pick they made in the 6th round, I thought it was Netani Muti, the Fresno State guard. Has an absolutely horrible injury history, and I have no idea if he can stay healthy. I'm not sure if he was draftable because of it, but they looked into it and thought it was worth a gamble, because when he was on the field, his natural power and mean streak really stood out to me. Alright, let's get to our first loser, and I have Tyrod Taylor here, the LA Chargers quarterback. You could put the Chargers here all together. I didn't think they had the best draft, and I will get a little bit into this still, but let's talk about Tyrod more in specific here. Started his first 4 years in Baltimore backing up Joe Flacco, then was brought in by Rex Ryan and was actually an above average starter for the Bills 3 years there. But when Sean McDermott came in, they weren't 100% satisfied with his risk-averse type of play. That's when they famously brought in Nathan Peterman to start the Chargers game, and he tossed 5 interceptions in the first half. He did go on to start the rest of the year and actually almost won a playoff game against Jacksonville that year. But the following offseason, they let him walk in free agency, and he took over with the Browns. Actually started out that season as well. But in the third game of that year, when he got beat up a little bit, Baker Mayfield entered the lineup and didn't give away the job. Would have been the right decision to put him in there anyway. So now Taylor, last year, goes to the Chargers to back up Philip Rivers. And it looks like this offseason, Anthony, the head coach, talks about him being the starter and the confidence he has in him. But now at the 6th overall pick, the Bolts select Justin Herbert out of Oregon. To me, he was clearly the number 3 quarterback, not in that class with Burrow and Tua. So he was kind of the guy they ended up with who fell to them. To me, he's definitely not ready to start week 1. But when you look at Tyrod, if he struggles, and you know how these things go, at some point Herbert will take over. The offense will stall at some point, probably, because even though they have great weapons around Tyrod, when you look at that offensive line, they didn't add a single player at that front in the draft. People will be calling for Herbert's name, and Tyrod will be back to the bench. Like I said already, I didn't love the Chargers draft overall. I'm a big fan of Kenneth Murray and the potential he has, but trading both your day 2 picks in exchange to move up back into the first round when you really need depth behind a star-studded lineup, I just don't agree with that strategy. Back to a winner here, the New York Jets. I think there was really only like 3 or 4 draft classes that you could put above the Jets. Had a really solid draft with Joe Douglas and Adam Gase putting it together. Started things out with the massive Louisville tackle Mekhi Becton, who I think will immediately upgrade the zone rushing attack and has the agile feet to develop into a pass protector. So some things he needs to clean up there definitely, but something that can be taught. Then in the second round, they come back, actually trade back a few spots, pick up extra draft capital, and still get Baylor wideout Denzel Mims, who I had a late first round grade on. I think he can jump in immediately at that X receiver spot and improve what was one of the worst red zone offenses last season. Those 2 picks would already make Sam Darnold happy quite a bit. But then in the third round, the Jets came back now with 2 third-round picks. First, they brought in Cal safety Ashton David at 68th overall, who I pretty much already had penciled in as a second-round pick. I thought with his athleticism, the NFL would definitely cover that. I think he can legitimately line up at nickel day 1 because he definitely has the hips and the change of direction ability to excel in that spot, but also having the range to take over for Marcus May down the road if they decide to let him walk in free agency. With that second third-round pick, they select Jabari Zuniga, edge rush out of Florida. Tremendous explosiveness and natural talent. Definitely still a raw player at this point, but definitely somebody Greg Williams I think will have a lot of fun to work with. Also has inside flexibility and passing downs on the sub-packages. On day 3, I didn't love Michael Pirine, was not my top running back on the board, and maybe a little early for him, but he fits that zone rushing attack very well. And then the Jets traded back again with the division rival Patriots, actually, and pick up 2 more day 3 picks, with number 125 being FIU quarterback James Morgan. It was kind of surprising that they picked him up, but when you think of Sam Darnold getting banged up recently, it makes some sense. A lot of people around the league were very high on him, and I think he can really work out as a developmental player, at least as a backup, and maybe flip him for some picks down the road. And then a few spots later, the child offensive tackle Cameron Clark, who I think actually has some of that Mekhi Becton qualities in terms of being able to torque pads and finish guys on the ground in the run game. I think he could move inside at the next level and develop there. In the 5th, they made what possibly could be the biggest steal of the draft in Virginia cornerback Bryce Hall. He's coming off an injury and fell a bit because of that, but he's just such a smart corner with great ball skills. I will talk about him a little later in my steals segment. And then in the 6th round, you usually pick up special teamers, so I can't really hate grabbing the best one on the board in the punter from Texas A&M, Braden Mann, who might have been the best specialist overall in this entire draft. So definitely a strong class for the Jets. A team I think didn't do as well were the Seattle Seahawks. You know, John Schneider and those guys in the Pacific Northwest, they do this every year. They take somebody in the first round who nobody really values that highly, nobody's talking about as a first rounder. I heard some chatter about the first round pick they made, but to me, all of their selections through the first 2 days they overdrafted on. Started out with Texas Tech linebacker Jordan Brooks, who I think is a nice downhill linebacker and the league really seems to be high on, especially with the Hawks. He can be that free-flowing player that you really love. But I had him ranked as a third-round prospect because he just struggles to deal with blocks and doesn't really show great awareness when he was in zone coverage. When you consider the Ravens scooped up LSU's Patrick Queen a pick later, that makes matters even worse. I know he's a player that they were very high on, but usually at least they trade back a few spots on the first day. And then the second to come back and trade up 11 spots, give up both of your third-round picks to pick up Tennessee edge rusher Darrell Taylor. Didn't make much sense to me. He's not very technically sound with his hands at this point. Kind of predictable with the rushes he uses just by his stance and the way he attacks. He's more of a developmental player to me, and actually I have him ranked a spot below the guy they picked up in the 5th round in Syracuse's Alton Robinson. And then with the 69th overall pick, an early 3rd rounder, they pick up LSU guard Damian Lewis, who definitely is a powerful run blocker, and those agility concerns I have with him can be kind of hidden in that Seattle offense where they run the ball a lot. But to me, just look one spot further and you can see Lloyd Cushenberry there, the center, who I think is a much better player and actually was my 35th overall prospect. So that didn't make any sense to me. As usual, Seattle softens the blow in on day 3. Got a big-bodied and sure-handed pass catcher in tight end Colby Parkinson, who I can see being Russ's best friend from day 1. I also kind of like the passing down back they selected in Miami's DJ Dallas, one of the better protectors in this draft. Can catch the ball, something they don't quite have at this point. Then there's the aforementioned Robinson, a speedster and Florida receiver Freddie Swain, who can also contribute in the return game. And then a seam-stretching big slot or flex tight end and Stephen Sullivan from LSU, who I thought really showed out at the Senior Bowl, was underutilized for the Tigers. So they definitely had a nice day 3 once again. But to me, some of those picks they made early on were just confusing. No matter how much the Seahawks seem to value those personal meetings with those guys and what kind of characters they are, I just think they didn't do a very good job working the board and getting the guys they like if they want to reach a little bit on those players. My next winner here is Tua Tagovailoa, quarterback out of Alabama. With how the 2019 Dolphins offseason went, it was pretty clear they weren't trying to compete for a championship, really. We're already blamed early on for it, but when they got blown out in week 1 and then traded away left tackle Laramie Tunsil as well, all those tank for Tua signs started coming up, and it ultimately materialized. Especially this past week, there were a lot of reports about Tua, how he could possibly fall down the draft board. But in the end, it was the Dolphins picking him up at number 5 overall. There's obviously the injury risk with him, but I think it was definitely the right call because to me he can be one of the premier passers in the league if he can stay healthy. For Tua personally, it would have definitely been nice as well to go one spot later to the Chargers, who have a really loaded roster as well. But I really like what Brian Flores is building down there in Miami. You saw some of the fight that team had, some of the culture that he established around the program, winning big games against the playoff-seeking Eagles or the Patriots in Week 17, which cost those guys a first-round bye, actually. Flores just needs to add those pieces to the puzzle now and to make things work. And Tua is the guy who will set it all off. The Dolphins also made it a priority to protect the new signal caller. While he's overrated to me a little bit, I think Austin Jackson at 18th overall gives them a very talented tackle prospect. Then early in the 2nd round to get one of my favorites in the draft, the pancake machine of Robert Hunt from Louisiana. Really gets after people in the run game. And while he played right tackle for the Raging Cajuns, I think he will move inside. And then in the 4th round, they come back and select another massive offensive lineman in Georgia guard Solomon Kindley. Miami also brought in Matt Breida, the running back from San Francisco, in exchange for a 5th round pick. The rest of the draft picks were invested into the defense, and they also drafted a long snapper. But in the 7th, they came back again and picked up Navy quarterback, running back, wide receiver, whatever you want to call it, Malcolm Perry. I think he can be an interesting gadget play if he makes that roster. And he can take some pressure off Tua, actually, in some wildcat quarterback situations. I think Ryan Fitzpatrick is still penciled as the starter as for now. And his play should determine when the rookie actually enters the starting lineup. But to me, Tua is just set up for success in Miami. I really like what they are doing and the situation he's in. The next big loser for me, or actually losers, are the AFC defenses trying to go up against the Chiefs next season. You already had to feel sorry for any defense trying to chase around all those track stars who are streaking down the field. But what they just did adds a different dimension. I know the Chiefs only drafted 2 offensive players over the weekend, with one of them being TCU offensive tackle Lucas Niang, who I think should be a backup in year 1 possibly, coming off an injury, but could be a very good player down the road. But with that final pick in the first round to pick up Clyde Edwards-Helaire, running back out of LSU, it just adds a different dimension to me. I know CEH was only my number 5 running back and he was the 51st player on my board, but I actually thought about moving him a few spots higher just because I love the floor he presents. He just has such a low sense of gravity and has that contact balance to gain yards after contact. He will give Kansas City a physical presence in the run game and a guy nobody really wants to tackle, who runs with an enormous chip on his shoulder. I think he's much more than just a banger inside. Maybe has the best start-stop quickness of any back in this draft, and he caught more passes than any other draft eligible back. So he's just another weapon in the Kansas City offense. And just think about it. You have all those speedy receivers streaking down the field. You have to chase them around on crossing routes and all that kind of stuff. And then Mahomes checks it down to this guy. And he becomes a bowling ball, and you are tired, and you come down, and he just wants to run your ass over. Nobody will want to tackle this guy. And I can already promise you that he will pick up some crucial third downs where he should be stopped a couple of yards short, but by his sheer will, he just drives ahead, picks up that first down, and the drive keeps going. So I kind of feel sorry for all those AFC defensive players. Back to another winner here, Jerry Jones from the Dallas Cowboys. You can put that whole Cowboys front office here, but Jerry's the guy you look at. And some of the picks they made, I think he's particularly happy about. I don't think anybody had a better time just sitting back and getting his guys in the draft than the headman of America's team sitting on his yacht. I didn't really study the 7th round pick in quarterback Ben DiNucci from James Madison other than the FCS championship game, but all those other picks they made in the draft to me presented a lot of value. Started out round 1, they just sit there at number 17 and have one of the top 2 receivers in the draft slide to them. To me, there was just no way Jerry Jones is going to pass on a superstar receiver from nearby Oklahoma and possibly let him slip to the division rival Eagles. No way. If you put him with already Michael Gallup and Amari Cooper, that receiving trio is lethal. And as already reported, the Eagles actually tried to trade up a spot before the Cowboys at number 16 to grab CD. Atlanta didn't like that trade, stayed put, and the Cowboys ended up with my number 2 receiver. It was almost like a 1A and 1B thing with him and Jerry Jeudy. They also got another Oklahoma Sooner later on in the 3rd round, and Neville Gallimore, who was one in the 40s for me as a defensive tackle. On the strengthens was already an excellent rotation on the interior of the D-line. Adding to that, they pick up 2 physical press corners and Alabama's Trevon Diggs in the 50s. Another small school guy like Tulsa's Reggie Robinson, who has really sky-high potential. If those 2 really pan out, I could see them moving Chidobe Awuzie back into the slot the way he played at Colorado and can do a lot of different things as an overhang defender, blitzing off that spot, covering slot receivers. All of a sudden you have guys like Anthony Brown and Jordan Lewis being your cornerbacks 4 and 5. And if they want to get paid, you can just let them go. You have the guys in-house that you can develop. With the first pick on day 3, they select Wisconsin center Tyler Biadasz, who a year ago looked like the top interior offensive lineman. And due to injury concerns and the play he had due to that last year, he fell down the draft board quite a bit. And if he's still recovering a little bit, getting back to 100%, I'm not sure if he will ever reach a play again that we saw from him as an All-American in 2018. But he definitely softens the blow of the retirement of another former Badgers center in Travis Frederick. And then in the 5th round, they come back and they grab Utah's Bradley and one of the biggest steals of the draft here as well. I had him as my 67th overall prospect, so picking him up is just outstanding. He's a man out there, can really set the edge of the run game, and already had major production as a pass rusher in college. Alright, we have to go back to one of those red slides again. And I actually have the New England Patriots here. Who might have questioned Bill Belichick and the Patriots organization? Have done so many great things. That's why they've won 6 championships over the last 2 decades. And the way Bill has managed that roster through the years has just been outstanding. However, I want to challenge him a little bit about what they did in these last few years in the draft. When you look at the first players they selected in each of the last 4 years, you have names like N'Keal Harry, Isaiah Wynn, Derek Rivers, and Cyrus Jones. The last one's not even on the roster, and none of the other 3 have really made a major impact on the team. I also think over that stretch when I look at those drafts, there were only 3 surefire starters from that entire time. This year, once again, I would put their draft class near the bottom for me. I know they don't care. They select the guys they think they fit their program. And I actually like some of the players they did select, but it's just not very impressive if you look at it overall to me. As they do every year, looking for a trade partner to trade out of the first round. Did so with the Chargers, pick up their 2 day 2 picks, which I really like. But when you look at what they did with that capital, I'm not 100% sold. 37th overall, they selected Lenore Ryan safety, Kyle Duggar, small school kid, really explosive athlete, with the size to drop into the box possibly. Add him as a mid-day 2 prospect, but it just doesn't strike me as that type of player BB would covet. He's not a very anticipatory player, and whether they play him at safety or maybe even will linebacker, because he definitely has the size if he just adds a little more to his frame. I just think there were better players out there at those spots. Then I'm a big fan of Joshua Uche, the outside backer they picked up from Michigan. But when you look at that trade up, had to give away 2 third-round picks. One of them ended up being Ohio State linebacker Malik Harrison, who to me is more of that kind of New England linebacker as a big thumping backer that you like to have on the field and exploit mismatches with running backs and protections. With that third-round pick, New England selected Anthony Jennings from Alabama, who absolutely looks like your prototype Patriot, but to me not the most dynamic pass rusher. Was a really good player at Alabama, but he just doesn't really flash on tape, just gets the job done. So I understand why the Patriots like him, but a little early for me personally. And then they come back and invest 2 more third-round picks in tight ends like Devin Asiasi from UCLA and Dalton Keene from Virginia Tech. I actually loved the UCLA tight end as a potential target in that 100 range. Heard reports about him moving up draft boards late. And to me, Keene certainly has the upside as an underutilized pass catcher with the Hokies. And he already put in really good work as a blocker. But once again, they traded up for the latter one. I personally thought he would go in the 5th or 6th round. And also, no, I did not study the Marshall kicker from round 5 or hear his name called. Ever. So, looking at the class altogether, it just doesn't blow me away. Another winner for me, that analytics-based Cleveland front office. Man, they just killed this draft. As much fun as you can make about their front office, how that analytics team wants to overview the game plans, and after just hiring Kevin Stefanski, who was coming off a 10-point showing versus San Francisco in the divisional round. And some of that offensive success definitely was due to Gary Kubiak being there advising him. You have to applaud them for what they did in this draft. First, they selected my number 4 overall prospect and my top tackle, in Alabama's Jedrick Wills Jr. at number 10, who is an aggressive run blocker and a technically sound pass protector. And then in the second round, they bring in my 29th ranked prospect at the 45th spot in LSU safety Grant Dalpett, who has incredible range and can do a lot of different things if you move him into the slot. With those two, they complete the transformation of that offensive line, who was pretty poor last season, to one of the better ones in combination with bringing in Jack Conklin from Tennessee. And Dalpett to me is a true single high free safety, can really take pressure off those young corners with the range he possesses and how he can bail them out. I actually don't love the 2 third-round picks in Missouri D-tackle Jordan Elliott and LSU linebacker Jacob Phillips. Elliott, to me, I thought he was overhyped in this process when watching the tape actually, but definitely has the talent to develop into a nice player. However, I really like what they did on day 3. First, they pick up John Mackey Award winner Harrison Bryant, who will add to that room that already has Austin Hooper, and depending on what they want to do with David Njoku, Bryant can be that target to pull away from defenders off play action, whether it's slipping underneath the formation on like split zone fakes or just running by linebackers. I could see him have quite a bit of success in that offense. My favorite one probably is Washington center Nick Harris, who is super mobile, has excellent lateral agility, and is just a perfect fit for that zone-heavy rushing attack Stefanski wants to run and already did in Minnesota last year. They have a potential out with J.C. Treader, the current starting center, in 2021, so I actually would not be shocked if Harris took over that spot down the road. And then Michigan receiver Donovan Peoples-Jones in the 6 is just crazy to me as well. I had a 3rd-round grade on him personally. Just a very explosive and talented pass catcher. Never really produced the way you would want him to at Michigan, but a lot of that had to do with poor quarterback play. Let's get to another loser here. And I have to say it, Aaron Rodgers, quarterback of the Packers. There weren't a lot of mock drafts out there that didn't have Green Bay selecting a wide receiver in the 1st round. I personally had Baylor's Denzel Mims going to them 30th overall. Instead of getting the much needed help in a pass catcher that Rodgers could use, they drafted as a replacement Jordan Love. I think Rodgers really has to be pissed with that front office and GM Brian Gutekunst. When you look at it, Packers are coming off a bad loss versus San Francisco in the NFC Championship game. But my lasting image of it is not Aaron Rodgers struggling with that defense, but most of his receivers were just blanketed, and his defense got steamrolled by that rushing attack of the 49ers. So even an interior defensive lineman would have been more towards the liking of the Green Bay signal caller. And in fact, they did not select a single receiver in a historically great draft at the position, with 36 of them going overall. Then in the second round, Green Bay comes back and they select Boston College's A.J. Dillon. He's that kind of massive running back in the mold of what Matt LaFleur had in Derrick Henry as the Titans offensive coordinator. But to me, he's definitely a day 3 prospect and was just a non-factor in the passing game at Boston College. I actually like Cincinnati's Josiah DeGuara quite a bit, who they selected in the 3rd round. They already talked about how they would like to use him in that Kyle Juszczyk role Shanahan has with San Francisco, and he already played some H-back, and I like the work he puts in as a blocker, really good effort and ability to put hands on people in space, but definitely a little early to me. And I think a guy like Liberty's Antonio Gandy Golden or some of those other receivers would have definitely helped out Rodgers more right now. Then the 6th round, Green Bay drafts 3 offensive linemen. I think Michigan's John Runyon is the one who can actually make an impact early on if you move him inside, possibly a 6th offensive lineman, but none of those guys really moved the needle for me in terms of immediate help. For a team that was just competing for the NFC and is still looking to compete for the conference. Well, I hope this lights a little bit of a fire under Rodgers after a few down years now recently. This draft simply does not give the signal caller a lot of help. On a more positive note, Jonathan Taylor, the running back out of Wisconsin, has to be thrilled with going to the Indianapolis Colts. I'm sure he would have loved to hear his name called on day 1, but he probably ends up in a perfect situation for him to be the best offensive line overall in football. They run quite a bit of zone where Taylor can just plant that outside foot and cut up field, but also a lot of power schemes, a lot of pulling guards, especially with Quentin Nelson leading the way, where the running back can really build up momentum, exploding through a wide open hole. Insert a 225-pound bowling ball like Taylor with a ton of explosiveness and 4.39 speed, and this becomes a scary sight. Malmack was a nice back. He's a little bit of a loser in this situation. But as long as Taylor doesn't fumble the way he did in college, and some of that was due to the amount of touches he received, I don't think there's any threat for him to not be the workhorse in that offense. Only 4 teams in the league ran the ball more than the Colts did last season. And while Taylor has to establish himself as an option 3rd down, when they already have a guy like Nyheim Hines there for that role, with Philip Rivers on the center now, nobody checks the ball down more to his backs than this guy. When you look at what he did with Austin Eckler last season, all the underneath passes he caught, considering all of that, Taylor's my early favorite for Offensive Rookie of the Year. Add to that one of my favorite wideouts in the draft in USC's Michael Pittman Jr. Early in the 2nd round, they already have one of the better receivers when healthy in T.Y. Hilton. Last year's 2nd rounder Paris Campbell, who can be a gadget player and actually opened up more room for Taylor on jet sweep fakes and as a screen fake on the backside to bind defenders. The Wisconsin running back definitely has some help around him now. He will also love Jack Doyle, who is an excellent run blocker, and there are already some solid other receivers on that offense. And then with the selection of Washington quarterback Jacob Eason, who himself is in a great situation, being able to sit at least for a full year, the Colts could be set at quarterback going forward if he develops. It's a really strong-armed kid. So Taylor has to love the ability to continue all that success he had at Wisconsin. My next loser is anybody in that Bears tight end room. What the hell are they doing? Before Chicago released Trey Burton, about a week before the draft, they had the most expensive group of tight ends in the league, after already paying Jimmy Graham $60 million over the next 2 years. Even though he looked like a shell of himself his last couple of seasons in Green Bay. Adam Shaheen was a 2nd round pick for them just 3 years ago, and he's only caught 26 passes since then. Last season, it was actually J.P. Holtz who led that Bears tight end room with 91 receiving yards. So you kind of understand why you want to upgrade that position, but they just haven't done it in a way that I think you should do in terms of building your roster. Their 2nd round pick, Cole Kmet out of Notre Dame, was my number 2 tight end. Should be the clear-cut starter and best all-around option for the Bears because he can execute a multitude of blocking techniques, has some upside as a pass catcher that wasn't quite used for the Fighting Irish offense. So he definitely qualifies as a guy in this conversation that you can classify as a winner. Still, the Bears now have 10 tight ends on that roster currently, but most teams actually only carry 3 on game days. Kmet is certainly an upgrade, and I thought he was the second best prospect at the position, but staying put at 43 when you actually need mid-round picks to build a roster to address a position that you've already spent so much money on is kind of a head scratcher to me. When you look at some of the guys who went a few picks later, like Minnesota safety Antoine Winfield would have been a great fit next to Eddie Jackson, or a guy like KJ Hamler, the receiver out of Penn State, would give them a true deep threat and produce some easy yardage for whoever starts a quarterback for them. It just doesn't really add up. And then you look at my number 1 tight end, Adam Troutman out of Dayton, going 105th overall to the Saints. And you just really question the value of that selection, when you probably would have gotten Kmet if you traded about 10 spots back. So obviously the Bears are a loser here, and those tight ends that they already have there in that room. When you look at Graham, won't really have a chance to revive his career probably, and should be more of a red zone target. And then even if 2 other guys make that roster, they will likely have to settle for rundown duties in heavy personnel and not be able to contribute in the pass game. The next winner for me is the Baltimore Ravens. When Ozzie Newsome, who to me is not only a Hall of Fame tight end, but also Hall of Fame executive, when he decided to retire a couple of years ago and Eric DeCosta took over as general manager, it was fair to assume that they would have kind of a drop-off in terms of how they built their roster, but it just hasn't happened. No matter who runs that draft for them, every damn year they knock it out of the park. And with pretty much every pick, you go like, that's so Ravens. Whether it was being patient with the first round pick and already seeing 3 linebackers selected ahead of them, and then still landing the dynamic LSU backer Patrick Queen, who I had as a 2A and 2B with Kenneth Murray in the top 20 prospect, or grabbing a physical, explosive back in Ohio State's J.K. Dobbins, who was my number 2 back, or then trading back in the 3rd round and acquiring extra picks on day 3 with New England. They just know how to play the game. In the 3rd, he picked up Texas A&M defensive lineman Justin Madubuike, who I think is a super flexible and explosive kid with a ton of room to grow. And while he wasn't my best available receiver at this point, Texas's Devin Duvernay is an excellent addition to that offense because of what he can do as a slant or bubble option on the RPO game. And then late in the 3rd to pick up Malik Harrison as another great fit as more of a downhill Mike if you slide Queen in at will. Just really good stuff. Then in the 1st pick on day 3, John Harbaugh brought in one of his brother's standouts actually. In Michigan got Ben Bredesen, who I think could immediately replace an all-time great in Marshall Yanda at that right guard spot possibly. And then later on Saturday to bring in James Prochet in the 6th, who I thought was one of the best receivers in the country last season, over 100 catches, really secure hands. And then in the 7th to grab a really smart, instinctive safety in Iowa's Geno Stone. This just puts the cherry on top. Yeah, I wasn't too high on Tyree Phillips or Broderick Washington, who he picked up earlier. But to me, there's just nothing that really comes to mind for this draft class other than that's so Ravens. Alright, I have 2 more losers. The first one being the only actual prospect in this draft to be listed among the losers. And it's kind of easy to understand why he made it here. Anthony Gordon, just didn't hear his name called at all. Gordon is a guy who transferred from junior college in 2018, lost out to Gardner Minshew in a quarterback competition that season, but then last year shot onto the scene. In his 1 year as a starter, all he did was complete almost 500 of his 689 passes for 5,579 yards and 48 touchdowns compared to 16 interception. Like it is every year until now when Mike Leach actually left the program, a lot of the production for the quarterback at Wazoo was due to the air raid system. And I understand that Gordon doesn't really blow anybody away physically with what he presents, but he's a pretty good player to me. He might not have a huge arm, but it's more than adequate. He's not a great athlete, but he can really buy time inside the pocket and is tough when he does decide to take off. And he's really loose with the ball at this point, but that is something that I think he can fix. I really like the way he puts the ball to where receivers don't really have to break strides and have opportunities for yards after the catch. The former Cougar signal caller was my number 8 quarterback. I thought he could go early on day 3 in a pretty weak quarterback class after that top 4 or even top 2 to me. Overall, there were 13 quarterbacks that heard their names called, and Gordon surprisingly wasn't one of them. He's far from a perfect prospect, but he has to be frustrated to not get any call After just finishing second in the entire country, behind only number one overall quarterback Joe Burrow in both passing yards and touchdowns last season, Seahawks have since signed him as an undrafted free agent, and he should be an excellent backup with no other quarterback on the roster other than Russ at this point, but I think Gordon actually deserves a chance to at least compete somewhere. I read another couple of players who definitely enjoyed draft weekend, Saquon Barkley and Daniel Jones, and I have to give it up. David Gettleman and Joe Judge, they deserve some credit here. The Giants GM did what he was supposed to do after surprising everybody by selecting quarterback Daniel Jones last year and then taking the running back second overall and superstar Saquon. He protected his investments. While I did have Andrew Thomas as my fourth offensive tackle, I still thought he was a top 15 prospect and he can immediately jump in at that right tackle spot, even if I would have preferred the Giants to move back a little and grab one of the other offensive tackles. In the third round, the G-Men selected a developmental prospect I like quite a bit in UConn's Matt Peart, who could start at right tackle down the road if Thomas takes over for Nate Solder on the left side, and then to come back early on day 4 and grab another one of my top 100 prospects in Oregon's Shane Lemieux, the guard. Just really like that. Was a high quality starter for 52 games for the Ducks and just puts them at a different level. If Big Blue can move either him or possibly Kevin Zeitler to the center spot, I think they can put their best 5 out there, which is now pretty strong all of a sudden. Saquon should have a lot more room to work with behind a great zone blocking O-line in front of him, while the quarterback should not get killed back there as much as he did if he just learns to get rid of the ball when nothing is there downfield. I think Gettleman had one of the best overall drafts I can remember from him. While I still think he's stuck in his thoughts about using the draft picks he has and not grabbing whoever is there instead of just operating the board, he did select my top-rated safety in Alabama's Xavier McKinney and a day 1 starter at nickel in UCLA's Darnell Holmes to upgrade that secondary. Then he spent 4 of his final 5 picks on the poor linebacker group, with 2 of them actually having outside flexibility, so definitely helped that team. My final losers of this draft process, fantasy football is somewhat of an off-the-board pick here. For me, the draft is always somewhat of a grueling process when you get to watching those prospects in the 300 to 400 range who probably won't even be selected. But there are also guys who you get really excited about watching, and it gives you a bit of an upper hand when you already know all those guys as you get to fantasy football season. However, this year, more than I can remember in a while, a lot of things have become kind of murky, seeing what happened in the draft. So many running back committees have been formed, whether it was Detroit pairing up Kerryon Johnson with my top running back DeAndre Swift, Cam Akers now building a dynamic 1-2 punch with Darrell Henderson in LA most likely, J.K. Dobbins being thrown into the mix with all those guys in Baltimore, and then A.J. Dillon for the Packers joining a backfield with a rising star like Aaron Jones. Also, Zach Moss with the Bills definitely having a role to go with Motor Singletary, so definitely a lot of shake-up there. But it'll be tough to figure out how all those touches are going to be split once the regular season rolls around. And we also saw a bunch of receiving corps being upgraded with several weapons to spread the wealth between. Overall, there were 36 receivers selected, as I mentioned already. And there were even some guys who didn't hear their names called, who I like quite a bit. So it will be fun for me to go in for all the depth charts of every team and trying to decipher who is worth a look or who I can pick up on the waiver at some point. But for most of those casual fans, it can be a headache if you don't really know some of those names. I usually never draft quarterbacks in those single-digit rounds, but we could see some of those top quarterbacks rise a little, or will there be more of an emphasis on those elite tight ends? We will see. And my final winner here, I have the Buffalo Bills. Nothing they did was really spectacular, but to me, Brandon Beane and Sean McDermott have once again put together a really solid draft. Before we talk about any of the actual picks they made, they invested their first round pick in Stephon Diggs. But you look at the pick that the Vikings got from them at 72nd overall, picked up LSU receiver Justin Jefferson, who was a top 5 receiver for me. But I think Diggs is a better fit for the Buffalo offense, more of a deep threat who can play on the outside. And then you get to when the Bills actually were on the clock in the second round with the 54th overall pick to select A.J. Epinesa, the defensive lineman out of Iowa. He was just born to be a Bill. Excellent with his hands, has a lot of power, and gives them another piece up front. They can move around a bit. I thought he would have been a nice target with the original first round pick, actually. So to me, they got 2 first rounders kind of. Then the third, they came back and selected Utah's Zach Moss, who gives them a perfect bruising type of runner to complement Devin Motor Singletary. On day 3, they pick up a couple of receivers in UCF's Gabriel Davis, who's a deep ball specialist and really matches well with Josh Allen's big arm. And then Oregon State's Isaiah Hodgins, who is more of a big-bodied contested catch guy who can bail the quarterback out when he decides to put it up in the air, which Josh does in some situations. In the 5th round, they selected quarterback Jake Fromm from Georgia, who might be the polar opposite of Josh Allen, actually, with that risk-averse style of play. But he excels in the quick game, which the Bills quietly have gone more to with more of that 11 personnel up-tempo offense. He should be a high-quality backup. They might be able to deal for some draft capital down the road. And rather than advocates drafting kickers, and I didn't really study the class, I know that Tyler Bass has a lag. You saw it at the Senior Bowl, drilling those 50-plus yard field goals, and he could immediately replace Stephen Hauschka, who has converted less than 80% of his field goal attempts in each of the last 2 years. I'm also a big fan of the guy they picked up in the 7th round, in the cornerback from Pitt, Dane Jackson. Really feisty, competitive guy. Should be competing for that starting nickel spot with Deron Johnson. So maybe there wasn't anything spectacular with that draft, but it was just a really rock-solid class to me. Alright, let's look at a couple other drafts I liked and didn't like as much. First up to the positives, Arizona Cardinals. I thought getting Isaiah Simmons at number 8, actually that 2nd round pick being DeAndre Hopkins, basically a superstar receiver, and the 3rd to steal a guy like Josh Jones, my number 5 tackle, who I had a 1st round grade on as well. Really good stuff. Later on, they pick up a couple of big defensive linemen in the middle. They definitely improved over draft weekend and could be a strong contender in the NFC West. Then the Minnesota Vikings, who I already talked about trading Stephon Diggs and picking up that extra 1st rounder. So who they selected LSU receiver Justin Jefferson with, who I like a lot, even though I think Diggs is better with Buffalo, like I just mentioned. But then that 2nd pick in the 1st round, trade back a little, pick up extra draft capital, still get Jeff Gladney at 31, who I like better than a couple other corners who went before them. Linebacker Troy Dye in the 4th, who I had a 3rd round grade on. Kenny Willekes really late, who might not be a great athlete, but already adds some pass rush value. So I really like some of the things they have done. And then the Carolina Panthers, who famously didn't select a single offensive player, really invested in Matt Rule's defense. And they get guys who fit the scheme. At 7th overall, Derek Brown, who's a monster in the middle. And actually a few rounds later, I think in the 5th or 6th round, they get another guy from Baylor, who Rule coached already, in Bravion Roy, who can do some of those things that Brown does as well, if you want to move him around or give him a breather. Isaiah Simmons definitely would have made sense in the 1st round, but then with that last pick in the 2nd round, they pick up Jeremy Chin, the safety out of Southern Illinois, who already has played some linebacker and sub packages and could have a role there as well. And with their original 2nd rounder to pick up Yetur Gross-Matos, who I think has all the tools to develop into an excellent player, even though I didn't love the tape. Also a really good pick. I thought he was a 1st rounder for sure in a pretty weak edge class. Also Troy Bright, corner out of Notre Dame, some of the other guys they picked up. Just a really solid all-around class. And some of the more questionable draft classes to me, Atlanta Falcons at 16 just sit there. I already talked about the Eagles wanting to trade up with them. Instead, they stay put to pick up A.J. Terrell, who was my 8th ranked corner. Definitely know what people like in him with that speed and length. But to me, just a little early. I like Marlon Davidson in the 2nd round, right around the range where I would have taken him. Curious about their 3rd round pick. My Tennessee, the center out of Temple, around that range where I would take him, but to me he's a center-only prospect. Not sure what the plan with Alex Mack is, and they just already invested so much into the offensive line, which I'm an advocate of. But it's sometimes you have to look at the track record and what you do with those picks. 2 4th round picks, who I like as players, but I thought were a little early as well. Michael Walker, the linebacker out of Fresno State, and Jalen Hawkins, safety out of Cal. Just a little earlier than I would have expected to go off the board. Not sure where they will play. Marlon Davidson to me is best suited as a free tech, but then to not pick up any real help on the edge. I know Walker can be flexed out there, played a lot there at Fresno State, but not really a true difference maker from day one possibly. Then the Eagles in the 1st round, my number 7 receiver Jalen Reagor, 21st overall. I thought they should have thrown the house at the Falcons if CeeDee Lamb is available for you. I like the type of speed they picked up for the draft, also trading a 5th rounder for Marquise Goodwin. Just think of the guys to pick up. John Hightower is a guy I like. Definitely added speed to that offense, which was severely lacking. But then if you added CeeDee Lamb as more of a yards after catch guy and just a much better overall receiver, was my number 8 overall prospect. Should have really gone for it there. The second round, Jalen Hurts, I think is a developmental player. I like the makeup. I think he will do really well with the Eagles in a backup role, and I understand the idea of investing into a backup with all the injuries Carson has had, but a little early for me as well. And then the third round pick, Davian Taylor, linebacker of Colorado, I thought was really early. I know he has the athletic upside, but a lot better linebacker prospects on the board at that point. Just felt like a little bit of a reach for me. They made some nice picks on day 3 late to pick up Auburn offensive tackle Prince Tagovailoa, who had a day 2 grade on, but fell because of injuries. So I'm not quite sure. They got better, definitely. Did they play the board as well as they probably could have? Maybe not. And then the Las Vegas Raiders, making Henry Ruggs the first receiver off the board, I have no problem with if you value that speed threat. But then at the 19th spot, with that second pick in the first round, Damon Arnett, the corner out of Ohio State. I had a mid-day 2 grade on him. I thought at least they could have traded back a little to pick him up. I have no problem with taking shots at the guys you like, even though I have them a little lower on my board. But then at least to get back some value for a guy that probably would have gone a little later otherwise. In the third, pick up 2 receivers, Lynn Bowden out of Kentucky and Brian Edwards out of South Carolina. Like both those guys, maybe a little early for them. And then at the end of the third round, at the 100th overall pick, to go back to Clemson once again and pick up Tannen Hughes, who to me is mostly a special teamer and sub-package linebacker rather than a real impact player right away. That's definitely a little rich for me. Then the 2 guys in the fourth, in guard John Simpson, who's a physical run blocker, and Amik Robertson, who I really like as a feisty nickelback. I like those much better, but overall what they did early on through those first 2 days, I disagree a little with. Now let's get to my biggest steals, and I'll just work down with them the way they came off the board. At 17th overall, CeeDee Lamb, the wide receiver out of Oklahoma. Already talked about him with the Dallas Cowboys. Like I said, to me, Jerry Jones just wouldn't let a star receiver like that from nearby Oklahoma stay on the board, possibly for the division rival Eagles. To me, Lamb was the top player available at that point, my number 8 overall prospect actually. And that offense, which was already ranked number 1 in total yardage, just went to a different level. Lamb can immediately slide in as an X receiver and allow Amari Cooper to move more into a slot role, where he can avoid press coverage from guys like Stephon Gilmore or Jalen Ramsey, who already gave him trouble last season. Plus, Lamb actually steps up in those big games, or at least has done so for the Sooners, while Amari has kind of shrunk. Still, Amari is definitely one of the more savvy route runners in the league. And if you throw third-year guy Michael Gallup into the mix there, who might have had the most quiet 1,000-yard season I can remember in a while, we have a trio that rivals the best in the entire league to me. Then in the second round, already discussed as well, A.J. Epinesa, the edge rusher at Iowa. Inside-outside flexibility. And before the 2019 season started, Epinesa was looked at as an eventual top 10 pick. And even a few months ago, I thought he was a lock for the first round. That athletic testing definitely wasn't appealing to NFL clubs. When at the combine, he couldn't crack the 5-second mark in the 40 and put up modest numbers across the board. But to me, when you put on the tape, you just can't tell me that he's not a first rounder. No, he's not as explosive as a Chase Young or has the kind of bend like Caleb Von Chase on. But he has a ton of natural strength to hold his ground in the run game. And is already very advanced with hand usage. Could just straight up move guys backwards in the quarterback's lap if they set him too softly. I think he would immediately start across from Jerry Hughes at defensive end and can be a mismatch against guard and third downs. Later on the second, the Titans picked up Christian Fulton. I already heard before the draft that he might slide a little bit, but to me I thought he would still go late first, early second, so to get him at the end of the second round was really a gift for the Titans. Fulton was my number 3 corner in the draft, and I had him clearly ahead of guys like Clemson's A.J. Terrell and Ohio State's Damon Arnett, who went 16th and 19th overall respectively. I get that Terrell has better length and speed maybe to work in a press-heavy scheme, and Arnett is the type of feisty competitive players the Raiders have coveted since their current regime. But Fulton was my 23rd overall prospect. I think it's the ability to mirror guys off the line and to really stick in the hip pocket. Also has the fluid lower body to adjust in zone coverage. And while he's not super interested in tackling, we see guys like that go a lot higher than him. Then in the third round, The Cardinals just stole Josh Jones, my number 5 tackle. Still one of the most surprising developments in the draft to me. Why he fell, ranked 25th overall on my big board. And with teams like the Dolphins, Seahawks, Titans, and Vikings having picks in that range, I definitely thought one of those teams would pick him up. And then even after that, with Cincinnati having that first pick in the second round and all those other teams having another crack at him, it was very surprising to me to see him fall like that. Jones definitely needs some work in his pass sets, kind of pedals backwards at times to establish position, but he really gets after people in the run game and has a punch and protection to stun pass rushers. Showed what he's capable of with the way he progressed the Senior Bowl against top competition. So after selecting Clemson do-it-all freak Isaiah Simmons with an 8th pick and then using a second rounder for a star receiver like DeAndre Hopkins to grab Jones at that point, who will likely be a day one starter at right tackle, is just outstanding. The next guy I want to talk about is Adam Troutman, the tight end out of Dayton. He was my top-rated tight end and a mid-day 2 prospect for me. So maybe the value isn't quite through the roof as it is with some other guys who I will still talk about here. But when you consider 4 other guys at the position, heard their names called earlier, with guys like Josiah DeGuara and Dalton Keene being 2 of the earlier ones, getting him with that second to last pick on day 2 is surprising to me. Troutman's an aggressive run blocker who can secure the edge for Alvin Kamara on those outside zone plays. And not only can he win above the rim and the ball is in the air, but when it's in his hands, he takes smaller guys for a ride, really physical after the catch. I know the Saints traded away all of the day 3 capital to pick up the tight end, but their roster was already pretty stacked. Signed a lot of guys in free agency, and they needed impact players over depth at this point. So I don't necessarily disagree with that strategy. Another guy I already mentioned earlier, Bryce Hall, the corner out of Virginia. Jets picked him up in the 5th round. I know I didn't want to talk too much about players who dropped mostly based on injury, but for Hall, it's not like he's coming off a recent major surgery. He had worked on his ankle all the way back in October, and I believe NFL decision makers just didn't fall in love with him because of what they perceive as average athleticism. To me, Hall has a really nice frame, shows excellent football intelligence and instincts for the position, and then great ball skills once it's in the air. Don't necessarily think he would have started at the combine, might not be a superb athlete, but has more than adequate tools to add to a secondary. So picking a guy like that up when he was my 65th overall prospect to get him in the 5th round is definitely something that the Jets and Greg Williams can get on board with. I would actually not be surprised to see him start for them by midseason. And then another one of my favorites, Nick Harris, the center out of Washington. Similar to some other guys on this list, I know why front offices passed on this guy until the 5th round, but I just disagree. Harris may not be the strongest offensive lineman. You can argue that it's just a center-only prospect, but he's just a perfect fit for the zone-heavy scheme Stefanski wants to run with the Browns. Might not quite be able to anchor against those 330-pound nose tackles who can drive him backwards a little bit in protection. But Harris's outswing agility, that ability to get hands on people on the move, like I already mentioned, when I talked about the Browns having a great all-around draft, I think there's a potential out in J.C. Tretter's contract next year. And if Harris bulks up a little through an NFL training program, I would not be shocked to see him replaced as a veteran next season. Next up, Bradley and I, the edge rusher for the Cowboys, picked him up with that last pick in the 5th round. I was just baffled by Knight continued to slide down the board. He was my 67th overall prospect and went a good 100 spots later without any apparent reason, really. Yeah, his arm length isn't optimal and he's not the most dynamic athlete, but he's so much better than some of those developmental edge rushers that were selected ahead of him. He's a nasty cross-chop combination and can really convert speed to power and force quarterbacks off the spot. Had 13 sacks last season already. And in my write-up for the positional rankings, I compared him to a little taller Brandon Graham, actually. To add him to a defensive line that has some question marks across from DeMarcus Lawrence, with those other guys being in and out of the lead across from him. That's just fantastic value. 2 more guys here. The first being Donovan Peoples-Jones, wide receiver out of Michigan, going to the Browns. Once again, I had him 100 spots exactly higher on my board. I thought he should have gone on late in day 2, maybe early day 3. There are some things he needs to clean up about his route running, not the most crisp routes necessarily, and there's definitely a lack of production. But a lot of them, to me, like I already talked about, had to do with the quarterback situation. Jay Patterson, one of the worst passes in the country last season. DPJ had one of the most impressive all-around combines, running a 4.48 in the 40 and just jumping out of the gym. I think he best fits in the slot actually, where the Browns already have Jarvis Landry, but he can place him on the outside. And to me, he might already be the third most talented receiver on that entire roster, and he should be more productive as a pro than he was in college. And my last steal here, Eno Benjamin, the running back out of Arizona State. Once again, really no idea why this happened. I knew I was a lot higher on Benjamin than most people, had him as my 6th overall running back and my 78th prospect in the draft. But for him to be the 15th guy to hear his name called at the position in the final round of the draft is just absurd to me. The former Sun Devil likes to dance around the backfield a little bit and had a bit of a fumbling problem last season, even though I think a lot of that had to do with his freshman quarterback, some exchange problems there. But I'm just a big fan. Benjamin is a violent runner, can make people miss with a very emphatic jump cut, but also doesn't mind sticking a face mask into the chest of a defender and going through him. Kenyon Drake was outstanding for the Cardinals last season when they brought him in via trade, but Eno could easily put up a good 500 yards from scrimmage next season and be used to turn away some games next season. Drake not necessarily that type of back. Benjamin did a lot of that for the Sun Devils. And now some of the guys I thought teams reached on. The first one being that 6th overall pick, Justin Herbert, the quarterback out of Oregon. Already talked about him a little bit when I mentioned Tyrod Taylor as one of my bigger losers of the draft weekend. Herbert definitely has prototype measurements and all the art talent in the world with tremendous upside, but I'm just not sure if he can ever reach that. Started almost 4 years for the Ducks and never really improved. I know he had great stats last season, but a lot of that had to do to the amount of screens he threw. Very simplistic offense that didn't ask him to do a lot. Like I said, a bunch of screen, faking those and throwing rail routes off it. Kind of a one-read quarterback who doesn't see the field well quite yet to me. He was my 37th overall prospect, and I thought he would have gone more in that Jordan Love range as a developmental prospect at the quarterback position in the late first round or early second. Then Damon Arnett, the corner out of Ohio State, going 19th overall to the Raiders. Just like the Raiders did last year already, they delivered a shocker on night one and selected the second corner from the Buckeyes. I really had not seen Arnett in any mock draft since early on in the process. Yeah, maybe some of that might have to do with some of the off-field concerns that he's had in the past. I think we would have actually been talking about him more if there wasn't anything. He was my 10th ranked corner and the 66 overall prospects on the board. I definitely like the competitive and physical style of play, but when I look at the Vikings being able to trade down a few spots and still select TCU's Jeff Gladney while adding some draft capital, it just makes this pick look bad. And like I mentioned already, I don't mind Arnett being the guy they want to target, but Mike Mayock and those guys could have definitely traded down a few spots and still gotten the Ohio State corner while adding some capital. The next guy at the position was actually selected number 30 overall by the Dolphins, and even he was a surprise in Noah Igbinoghene. I really have Jordan Brooks actually 28 spots lower than Arnett even in my big board, but we already at least heard some stuff about him potentially sneaking up into the first round. And Seattle's just a team that always grabs a guy and nobody really looks at as a first rounder and surprises us with it. But usually they at least trade down to pick their guy. And to me, the value just doesn't add up. The Texas Tech backer ranked 8th at the position for me and in the 90s overall, which was actually behind Michigan State's Joe Bacci, who I have no idea how he went undrafted. I'm sure they love the way Brooks can run and his aggressive style of play, but I have question marks about how he can work around blockers and disengage, and as well as the awareness he shows in zone coverage, which they ask a lot of from the linebackers to cover ground in that Seattle scheme. I could absolutely see him work out if he takes over KJ Wright once they can't pay that guy anymore, but the 27th overall pick on a guy that's a little rich for me, especially when LSU's Patrick Queen was the guy who was selected just a pick later by the Baltimore Ravens. Another guy who I heard about would probably go in the first round, but to me just wasn't worth that pick, is Isaiah Wilson, the offensive tackle of Georgia, across from Andrew Thomas. In my one and only mock draft, I actually had Wilson go into the Seahawks a couple of spots earlier. So, like I said, I'm not shocked that it happened. Makes a lot of sense in both those offenses, which put an emphasis on running the ball and having big guys up front. But Wilson didn't actually make my top 100 list. And while I see the upside for a guy like that as an old school power right tackle, I'm not sure if he has this agility to even survive on the outside against those true speed rushers. I talked about how Tennessee would look at that tackle position in my mock draft, because until Thursday it looked like the void left by Jack Contling would leave a battle between Dennis Kelly and Tyson Brylo for right tackle. So Wilson's definitely an upgrade at that spot if he can develop, but to me, not worth the price of a first round pick. And then at 62nd overall, the Packers selected A.J. Dillon, the running back at Boston College. I already talked about that a little bit as well. Dillon's kind of an out-of-date 250-pound bruiser who had a great career at Boston College. Nothing to take away from him there. But I just don't think his success will translate quite that way to the next level. Watching him play, he simply doesn't have that kind of footwork to adjust on the fly. And if he can't build up momentum, he just isn't very effective. It's kind of a non-factor in the passing game as well, with just 21 career receptions. I get that LaFleur looks at him as a similar player to Derrick Henry, who he had in Tennessee, but I just don't think those two are in the same class. And Green Bay already has kind of that type of back in Jamal Williams, who has done more on passing downs. Dillon was my 14th ranked running back, and certainly had a day 3 grade on him. And then the Browns at 97th overall, I already talked about that I really loved their draft. But the one guy who didn't make sense to me was Jacob Phillips, the linebacker at LSU. From the outside looking in, drafting the leading tackle of an undefeated national championship team doesn't sound too bad, but I probably watched about 50 LSU tapes to evaluate all the other guys around Phillips, and he just never really flashed to me. I know he can run pretty well, but that's about it to me. He's conservative against the run, gets hung up with blocks, and is content with drag tackles. There were at least 13 other Tigers that were actually better than Phillips, and he wasn't even one of my top 20 linebackers. One pick later, the division rival Ravens selected my LB6 in Ohio State's Malik Harrison, who actually placed downhill and tested pretty much the same. So that's just kind of ridiculous to me to pick him at that spot. A couple of spots later, the Patriots, as which I already discussed, Dalton Keene, the tight end out of Virginia Tech. Don't get me wrong, I really like Keene because the work he puts in as a run blocker and the flexibility to line up at H-back or possibly fullback since the Patriots just lost James Devlin to retirement. Also think he has some upside as a pass catcher, especially with how physical he is when he has the ball in his hands. But with that being said, only 59 career receptions in 3 years with Virginia Tech, and really only ran a couple of routes with the Hokies. Not only was my tight end one Adam Troutman from Dayton still on the board, but he actually traded away 2 of their 4th round picks as well to the division rival Jets. And Gang Green, with those picks, 125 and 129, selected FIU quarterback James Morgan, who was a developmental prospect who I thought New England would possibly like later on day 3. And Charlotte offensive lineman Cameron Clark, who I think has the potential to easily develop into an excellent 6th lineman at the very least. 2 picks later, the Eagles also reached on a player. I wasn't that high on Davion Taylor, the linebacker of Colorado. Another guy I thought went way too early, just solely based on traits. Taylor can really fly around, and I see the ability to run with guys down the seam, but he basically played big nickel for Colorado and never really made any actual linebacker read. He's really explosive, and you see him chase down some receivers from behind on tape, but he kind of gets lost in coverage. A lot of passer rating of almost 140 and was responsible for 5 touchdowns last season. If you're looking for an undersized linebacker who can run around, but actually has put out some really good tape, how about Appalachian State's Akeem Davis-Gaither, who was the first guy off the board on day 3. He was my 62nd overall prospect and a lot higher than Taylor for me. Alright, it's time to hate on some specialists, though I don't hate specialists, but like I already admitted, I didn't really watch any kickers in particular, and I had never actually heard of this guy's name before the weekend. Justin Roberts, the guy from Marshall. So I won't even act like I can evaluate the pick. But when I look at several other rankings, the consensus was that he wasn't even a top 5 kicker in this draft. And a guy like Georgia's Rodrigo Blankenship went undrafted, for example. If you select Roberts in the 7th round, I can't hate it, because that's where you look for special teamers, even though I would like to think that nobody would have selected him altogether otherwise. But to spend a 5th rounder on a kicker from Marshall, nobody has ever heard of even, it's kind of crazy to me. Especially when you look at some of the other guys who went a few spots behind him, like the Washington center Nick Harris, who I already talked about, Wisconsin wide receiver Quintus Cephas, or Georgia quarterback Jake Fromm. And then finally, Blake Ferguson, the long snapper out of LSU, who went 185th overall to the Dolphins. I mean, I knew him by name, but I didn't know drafting long snappers was really a thing. At the top of the 6th round, when guys like Notre Dame safety Aloy Gilman still on the board, or a guy like Donovan Peoples-Jones, the receiver out of Michigan who I talked in my Steelers segment, I'm not sure about that. So that wraps things up here for me. Pretty long episodes here recapping the entire draft. If you listened all the way through it, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I'd also be very happy if you left a like or subscribe to this channel. I know we're out of draft season now, but there's a lot of things to look at. Teams adding those final pieces over the offseason, which will be a very interesting and unique offseason. and I will keep you entertained over these next few months with some of the things I have planned going forward. Once again, thank you very much. I will be back next week already with some of the undrafted free agents that I think could make an early impact. So until then, see you later. Peace.